it makes you want to interact with it, And I think part of his intuition, about building these machines. I mean, it wasn't that he invented these machines. He was a designer. He made the machines attractive. He made them almost erotic in a sense. You want to touch them. You want to interact with them. That's Jobs' genius right there.
Yeah.
He makes these inventions are seductive.
You're absolutely right. You mentioned something about the psilocybin and something about ayahuasca, and I was wondering, what's the big difference between them?
Well, pharmacologically, psilocybin is the alkaloid in the mushroom, the magic mushrooms. It's very, very close to DMT chemically. Dimethyltryptamine is the visionary component of ayahuasca. But DMT by itself is not orally active, right? So it's prepared in combination with other plants. The DMT-containing plant that's used to prepare ayahuasca, which is called chacruna, or Psychotria viridis is the scientific name, is prepared along with the bark of Banisteriopsis caapi. And the bark of Banisteriopsis, the vine, which is also called ayahuasca, like the brew itself, just to confuse people, contains these alkaloids that are monoamine oxidase inhibitors. So in other words, they inhibit an enzyme in the stomach, in the gut, that would normally break down DMT. So you can make tea out of chacruna, you can drink it all day and nothing will happen because DMT is very easily broken down by this enzyme in the gut. So, but if you prepare it with an inhibitor of that enzyme, then it's protected and it's absorbed in the active form and it makes its way to the brain that way. So that's a way to make DMT orally active. Then you can go another approach. Psilocybin is a completely sort of different way of doing that because psilocybin is converted to psilocin in the body. There are enzymes that convert it to psilocin. Psilocin is the active form of psilocybin. It's very, very close to DMT chemically, but that slight difference in structure renders it orally active. It is not degraded by monoamine oxidase in the gut either. So it's absorbed and it's orally active. It's kind of two different approaches to the same problem, which is, how to make DMT orally active. I mean, psilocybin or psilocin is in some ways the perfect orally active form of DMT. Superior in some ways to ayahuasca because ayahuasca requires the use of at least two plants and it requires quite a lot of expertise to create this brew. I mean, it's folk technology, but you have to know what you're doing. You don't have to know what you're doing with mushrooms. They come ready to eat, as it were. Yeah, all you have to do, you don't even have to dry them. All you have to do is pick them and eat them. So no technology is required.
Well, a lot of knowledge about what mushroom to pick, though, is.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Well, you get that through trial and error, right? Because the people that are picking the wrong mushrooms, they're not around that long. It's old Darwinian mechanics kicks in here.
Then I've heard about that Salvia divinorum is useful in breaking drug habits. Have you observed this phenomenon?
I haven't observed it. I have heard that too. I've heard a lot of things about Salvia divinorum. That it's useful for depression, for example. But again, these are anecdotal reports. There's no formal clinical study on Salvia divinorum. or salvinorin A, which is the active compound. There's no clinical study that I know of, but there may be. I mean, there's actually a lot of interest in it right now because it is such a specific kappa opiate receptor agonist. Unlike psychedelics, it doesn't work on serotonin. It works on a whole different receptor system, which is closer to the opiate system, believe it or not. But it has profound, consciousness altering effects. Strictly speaking, you can't call it a psychedelic, I mean, depending on how you want to define that term.
Okay.
And I'm kind of I'm kind of rigid in my definition of psychedelic because I define it in terms of neuroscience and in terms of pharmacology. A true psychedelic is something that interacts with the 5-HT, the serotonin 2A receptors. All the all the classical psychedelics that we know, LSD, DMT, psilocybin, mescaline, kind of the classic psychedelics, they all interact with the serotonin 2A receptors, one of about 14 different serotonin receptor types. And so on the strict definition, you can say if it's not a 5-HT or a serotonin 2A agonist, then it's not a psychedelic, which is not to say, or you could have a looser definition and say, well, if it produces effects that are similar to these things, then we'll call it a psychedelic. But then where do you draw the line? Is MDMA a psychedelic? Not really. Is cocaine a psychedelic? Probably not. So a lot of it is semantics. How do you define this? Salvinorin A is a very interesting compound, though, because it is so selective for just this one subtype of receptors in the brain called kappa receptors.
I wanted to ask you, actually, somebody on this call, Wang Sheng, had a question about the MAO inhibitor. And that question is, could you take a prescription MAO inhibitor with ayahuasca, and would that work?
It would work, and it's not a good idea.
Oh.
Two reasons for that, a couple of reasons for that. There are two types of MAO, of monoamine oxidase, at least two types. There's MAO-A and MAO-B. And MAO-B is a form of the enzyme that primarily metabolizes what are called catecholamines, things like dopamine and stimulants like amphetamine and things like this are substrates for MAO-B. The tryptamines and serotonin and DMT and these things are more selective for MAO-A. And the alkaloids in Banisteriopsis are very selective for MAO-A. So they inhibit MAO-A and not MAO-B, at least not very much. And so as a result, they're perfect for activating DMT. The problem with the synthetic MAO inhibitors is they're by and large not selective. They inhibit both MAO-A and MAO-B. And if you inhibit MAO-B and you take stimulants, if you take something like tyramine, for example, you can get, it can cause hypertension. It can cause a stroke, basically. It can rapidly elevate your blood pressure, and it's quite dangerous. Most of the clinical MAO inhibitors, the prescription MAO inhibitors, which are not used much anymore because they are dangerous, they are so-called irreversible MAO inhibitors. So in other words, they inhibit the enzyme and they bind irreversibly to it. So the effect lasts about 2 weeks. And you have to wait until new MAO is synthesized by the body for the effects to go away. During that 2 weeks, you have to be very, very careful about what you eat, because many foods contain these phenethylamine type stimulants. Things like chocolate and wine and cheese, those kinds of things. I don't know if you look into the older psychopharmacological literature, you can read up about the cheese effect, which is basically people had to be very careful about, what they ate, because if you ate foods that contain tyramine, it can raise the blood pressure, and it's not good. So I don't recommend combining synthetic MAO inhibitors with DMT. It would work, but it's better to stick with the plants. I think it's much less hazardous. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think Wang Shang has a comment.
Okay.
It's interesting. I big list of tyramine foods that people with migraines have to avoid.
Right.
And, I know it's probably has to do with all the HT receptors in the brain and the gut. So it's good to know about those MAO inhibitors.
I mean, there are some of the newer MAO inhibitors. There are a couple of new generation MAO inhibitors that are reversible. And that's like the beta-carbolines in ayahuasca. I mean, the good thing about the beta-carbolines in ayahuasca is number one, they're very selective for MAOA, right, which is the target that you want to inhibit, and they're also reversible. I mean, the synthetics take 2 weeks to go away. Beta-carbolines take a few hours to go away, so they're inherently a lot safer.
Oh yeah, it's very easy to overdose on the older MAO inhibitors. That's why I never use them. They're
right.
Cardiotoxic for one thing.
Yeah, and for the same reason, another aspect of taking ayahuasca is quite safe. But you want to be careful if you're taking SSRI type antidepressants, because there can be an interaction with the MAO inhibitors, and by inhibiting MAO and also taking SSRIs, you can get what's called the serotonin syndrome, which you want to avoid.
Right.
At least you want to avoid the extreme aspects of it. I mean, you could argue that the psychedelic state is kind of like the serotonin syndrome, but and not to the degree that you have to worry if you're gonna pull out.
Speaking of the type of syndrome, what type of thing if say somebody is having a bad experience on the mushrooms or whatever? What kind of antidote, either psychological or medical, would you use?
Yeah. The best antidote, there are really no good pharmacological antidotes. The best one, if you have to give somebody something, the best thing to do is give them Valium or give them an anti-anxiety drug. Because usually that's the problem. They're just a little bit anxious, and they're just a little bit, panicked. And so the best antidote is to talk them down, to just... Okay. That's where the sitter or the facilitator comes in. If there's somebody that's there, say, look, remind them that they've taken a drug, remind them that it'll be over soon, and they just need to calm down and hang on.
Right, yeah, and the Valium interacts with a completely different set of receptors, so that would definitely be fine to do, I would think.
Yeah, you could certainly give Valium, and that will help, because that takes the edge off the anxiety, and that's usually the problem. I mean, it's very rare, unless you're getting into these, interaction issues that we talked about. It's very rare that the psychedelics themselves are not toxic. They're not gonna, there's no issue of being, poisoned or